Okay, so thinking back to last week, we were talking about the parts of the cerebrum. Okay, we talked about what we call the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Where the cerebral cortex is just a very thin shell on the very outside of the cerebrum, where some of the most amazing things happen, and those are the things kind of picked out here anyway that I wanted to focus on, like primary somatosensory area all the way down to the prefrontal cortex. Okay, now keep in mind that's all gray matter. Okay, deep to that surface of gray matter is where you find the white matter of your cerebrum. And like the white matter of the spinal cord that we previously learned about last class period, we learned that there's basically what we call tracks. Okay, tracks are just going to be the myelinated axons of our neurons that, in the case of our cerebrum, are able to go up and down, just like in the spinal cord. We call those that go up and down the cerebrum what we call projection tracks. Projection tracks are these kind of shown here in green, here in our central section, and then down here in our anterior view. We can see those are the green ones that just go up and down between the cerebrum and lower parts of the brain, connect even down into the spinal cord. We can actually see where they decussate with the pyramid, or decussate in the pyramids of our medulla oblongata. Remember, that's that crossing over. Okay, so projection tracks just carry information between the cerebrum and to the lower parts of the CNS, whether that's the thalamus, the brainstem, or even the spinal cord, or from lower parts of the spinous up to the cerebrum. Okay, commissural tracts, which I love that they begin with the letter C, have the ability to cross, and I love the C there. In other words, they cross from one cerebral hemisphere to another. So they enable like the right side of the brain to communicate with the left side of the brain, and connecting them is a structure formed by them, I should say, is a structure called the corpus callosum. And if actually you were to turn this page sideways, it looks like a C. You kind of ignore this little part of it. Okay, so it kind of even looks like a C, and there's C for corpus and callosum. So there's kind of a, I don't know, a lucky trend there. And then association tracts are these ones that kind of make it look like a rainbow in the top image, but they just are going to enable the front of the brain to communicate with the back of the brain, and vice versa. So signals can go front to back or back to front, but the key is within the same cerebral hemisphere. So they just connect gyri with each other in the same hemisphere. Okay. Okay, deeper into kind of the middle part of our cerebrum is where we find another set of gray matter, what we call the basal nuclei. Also goes by the term basal ganglia, although that's kind of the old school term. They've kind of gone away from that. Okay, the basal nuclei or ganglia are three masses of gray matter found deep within the cerebral hemisphere. They include the three nuclei: globus pallidus, putamen, and caudate nucleus. Okay, the pallidus and the putamen are two basal nuclei just lateral to the thalamus. Together they form what's called the lentiform nucleus. Caudate nucleus is a large head connected to a smaller tail by a long common-shaped body. Together, the lentiform and the caudate nuclei are called the corpus striatum. Okay, not that that's really important stuff. It's more anatomy-based information. Okay, that third bullet there is what I really want you to focus in on. Okay, along with the fourth bullet, what does the basal nuclei do? A major function is to regulate initiation and termination of movement. So it's like starting and stopping. Okay, the pallidus also helps regulate muscle tone. Remember, muscle tone is that like weak muscle contraction that's always taking place in our muscles, and that's required for specific body movements. A basal nuclei also is involved with subconsciously controlling contractions of skeletal muscle. They also think that the basal nuclei initiate and terminate some cognitive processes. So it's not necessarily just skeletal muscle motion and movement. Okay, it's things like attention, memory, and planning. And together with structures of the limbic system, they help to possibly regulate emotional behaviors. Speaking of the limbic system, let's talk about it now. We can describe the limbic system as our emotional brain. That's its nickname. That's what I definitely want you to know, because it governs emotional aspects of behavior. It is a ring of structures kind of on the floor of the cerebrum, and the diencephalon encircling upper part of the brainstem and that corpus callosum that I just mentioned. Okay, several things are part of our limbic system. Okay, and that includes the cingulate gyrus, lies above the corpus callosum, and its job is to regulate emotions and pain. It's also involved in predicting and avoiding negative consequences, so like not studying for a physiology test would be a negative consequence. Hopefully you use your cingulate gyrus to avoid that. Okay. The hippocampus we've mentioned earlier in this lecture is involved with memory. It's a portion of what we call the parahippocampal gyrus extending to the floor lateral ventricle. That's more anatomy-based stuff. Main thing is that the hippocampus is our big memory guy in the brain. The dentate gyrus lies between the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus. That's really just anatomy. I'm not going to get into specifics there. The amygdala, a group of neurons located close to the tail of the caudate nucleus, important for fear and discriminating objects necessary for human survival. Okay, so main thing is there, it's what causes you to be afraid. Okay, your mammillary bodies, which are actually parts of the hypothalamus. Remember we talked about the hypothalamus the other day, located close to the midline near the cerebral peduncles, serve as relay stations for reflexes related to the sense of smell. Two parts of the thalamus, what we call the anterior medial nucleus, are going to be a part of the limbic system. Olfactory bulbs, which are flattened parts of our olfactory pathway. They are involved with the sense of smell. Olfactory, olfaction, anytime you see that, it's an indicator that you're talking smell. And then the final structures include the fornix, stria terminalis, stria medullaris, medial forebrain bundle, mammillothalamic tract, which are linked by bundles of interconnecting myelinated axons. So anyway, all those different things make up our limbic system. Some of them I listed kind of specifics what they do. For example, I told you the hippocampus is involved with memory. You're going to want to make sure you know those situations, where I've given you what that structure does. When I kind of just list like the two nuclei of the thalamus, the anterior medial nucleus, and I don't tell you what it does, you don't need to really worry about it. What you're definitely going to want to know is that your limbic system is your emotional brain because it governs your emotions. Things like pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. It's even involved with olfaction or smell. Once again, olfaction, fancy word for smell. And as we just mentioned, memory. Okay. So we can describe it as emotional brain. I also like to kind of think of it as like the primitive brain. Okay. And when I say primitive, I mean like we're not primitive animals. We are very sophisticated animals. We, make music and compose, literature and, not everybody does this, but we can do lots of very sophisticated stuff that lesser animals, more primitive animals can't do. Okay. When, I talk, I always, think about like my dogs. Okay. And I'm sure I mentioned this the other day, but, dogs don't read, they don't write, they don't compose music. Okay. Dogs, their whole life is centered around satisfying, their emotional brain. Okay. Because dogs like belly rubs, they like naps, they like treats. That's like as complex as it gets. Okay. Although treats and naps are fantastic as humans, being in class, listening to a teacher talk about the human brain demonstrates that you're geared towards more important things. You are planning for your future. You're trying to make a career. You're becoming educated, and you're doing things that are much more advanced than just what makes you happy at that singular moment. Okay. Make sense? Okay. Let's talk about hemispheric lateralization. Okay. Although our brain is almost symmetrical on its right and left sides, there are some subtle anatomical and physiological differences between the two hemispheres that exist. Okay. You guys ever heard that, you might be left-brained or right-brained? Ever heard that term or that, description of somebody's thinking and what they're good at as being right-brain or left-brain? That's what hemispherical lateralization is. Okay. So although the two hemispheres share their performance of many functions, each hemisphere also specializes in performing certain unique functions. We call this hemispheric lateralization. Okay? And listed here in table 14.3 are those specific functional differences. On the left here is the functions of the right hemisphere. On the right is the functions of the left hemisphere. I'm not going to go through and read them all off, but it's a table I definitely want you to know. There might be a question or two on the exam. that says, you know, like which of the following is a left hemisphere function, or which of the following is not a right hemisphere function. So it is a kind of rare instance where I actually do want you to know a table. Okay, and then the kind of last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to the cerebrum is this complex process of integration. We've seen this word integration many times this semester. Okay, when we talk about integration in the cerebrum, we're talking about processing sensory information, analyzing it, storing it, and making decisions for various responses. Could be as simple as, you know, today you go outside, it's super cold. Okay, you send that sensory information of that cold sensation into your brain processes it and decides what to do with it. Okay, and you know, the response obviously is that we shiver. Okay, now much more complex integration or integrative functions of the cerebrum include wakefulness and sleep, language, emotions, motivation, as well as learning and memory. Okay, so I've kind of gotten into just very brief descriptions of each of those things, starting with sleep, which is a state of unconsciousness from which an individual can be aroused by stimuli. We talked about that the other day. We learned that the RAS, reticular activating system, is involved with that. We talked about how like smell won't wake you up, but loud noises and light can. Typically, we spend about 8 hours a day sleeping as adults, which means that sleep consumes about a third of our lives. If you've ever really just kind of thought about sleep, it's kind of a cool thing. We just kind of power down, our body goes into a, you know, kind of like a computer. It just is shutting down certain things. We recharge the batteries, and we get up and we're, you know, ready to go again. As far as sleep goes, it's very complicated, but we can kind of break it down into two phases, what we call non-rapid eye movement or NREM, and then rapid eye movement or REM sleep. And it's just detailing what happens to your eyelids as you sleep. If you are in REM sleep, it looks like you're just blinking, and it's actually, although it looks like you're kind of waking up, the deepest part of our sleep. That's when they say we dream. Whereas in REM is where your eyes really aren't fluttering or doing any blinking, and is actually the non-deep, or between the two, not as deep of a sleep. Language, humans use it to communicate with one another. It is a system of vocal sounds and symbols that convey information. Most commonly, it's either spoken and or written. Emotions, subjective feelings that you have about your own sense of well-being when a particular situation arises. They're usually accompanied by a variety of physical responses. And these can be autonomic or somatic. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is associated with things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, so on and so forth. Well, when we have emotions, changes can occur to heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing, your digestion. You might get mad and you might see blood flow to the face, and that's why it turns red. Your heart rate might go up, you start sweating. You might also see somatic motor responses where you're going to smile, you're going to frown, you're going to run, you're going to jump, or any other type of movement involving skeletal muscle contraction. Motivation is the internal processes that direct an individual's behavior toward a particular goal. Many motivated behaviors start with a need, which is anything that an individual deems necessary to have. One of those being like education, and being here on a cold day like today demonstrates that you are, you know, a motivated individual. Learning is the ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction or experience. Two main categories of learning include associative and non-associative learning. Associative learning occurs when a connection is made between two stimuli. Non-associative occurs when repeated exposure to a single stimulus causes a change in behavior. And then memory is the process by which information acquired through learning is stored and retrieved. Something that, you know, obviously I want every student to experience is not just learning something for the night, then coming the next day, taking the test, putting it on paper, and then forgetting about it. I want it to be committed to your memory so that you understand what you learned in this class years from now. And that's why I want you to, that's what I want you to know. Just what you learn is not just for taking a test, it's for lifelong. Okay. If you want to know a lot more about a lot of this stuff here on this page, you should take psychology and psychology related classes. You can learn a lot just about sleep, how to learn different things. It's really, really cool. If you haven't taken psych, I can't stress how cool it is. Very last thing I'm going to talk about here in this lecture are the cranial nerves. Okay. Although our cranial nerves are technically structures of the peripheral nervous system, and the title of this lecture is Central Nervous System, we're going to talk about them here because they're connected to the bottom of the brain, and that's what's pictured down here at the bottom with the brain upside down and highlighted with kind of a gold yellow color are the different 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Okay. They're numbered from 1 to 12 from anterior to posterior as they attach to the brain. So this first pair, the olfactory cranial nerves, are as far to the front as they get. And these are your two frontal lobes, and they're just on the bottom side of them. And then cranial nerve pair number 12 there, all the way to the back, attached to the medulla. Okay. Now, the cranial nerves can be classified as one of the following three types: sensory, motor, and mixed. Okay. Sensory cranial nerves are going to only contain or predominantly contain sensory neurons. Okay, your first two pair, for example, are an example of that, meaning that the sensory neurons are going to be carrying the signals into the brain. Okay, in the case of your olfactory cranial nerves, those are the ones that are associated with olfaction or smell. Okay, your optic nerves connect to the back of your eyes. Okay, which is kind of misleading, because all we see here for the optic nerves is like right here. Keep in mind, most of these nerves, they've been snipped, so they've been cut. Okay, so think of them like a trunk or a stump of a tree that's been cut down. All you see is the stump. Okay, this is like the stump of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so sensory are a one-way street going into the brain, whereas motor, we've got a one-way street this time. Since they contain or predominantly contain motor neurons, the signal's going in the opposite direction, away from the central nervous system. So sensory towards the CNS, towards the brain, motor going away from. Now, in the case of mixed nerves, they're like a two-lane highway, which means we've got traffic going in both directions, both sensory and motor neurons. So some signals are coming into the brain, some signals are going out. Okay. What I've done for you guys is grouped them here in our three categories: which of the following pairs fit where. So that will be helpful. I've also included here the final slide, a table that lists off those 12 pairs, gives you their number and their special name, tells you whether they're sensory, motor, or mixed. And then, and I promise you this is pretty brief, their function. It could be a lot more detailed for some of them. Okay. Now, does that mean we're going to talk about every single one of these this semester in great detail? No, I do want you to know this table. I will ask questions on the exam related to it. Okay. There are a couple here that we will focus in on more than others. For example, the first two, these are involved with sensation, so we'll talk about those. We'll probably get into that Thursday. We'll talk about the vestibulocochlear a lot. That's what carries the sensations, hearing, and balance. So very important for those two sensations. We'll talk a lot in our next lecture about the vagus nerves. Now, notice how vagus is spelled, V-A-G-U-S, not like Las Vegas. It's not the city, but vagus actually means wandering. This nerve originates, or these nerves, because there's two of them, attached to the bottom of your brain, but they run all the way down and innervate things like your intestines and your stomach, which are obviously very far away. So we call them wandering because they have to go all the way down through our neck, through the chest, into the belly, into the abdomen. So some of them we talk a lot more about than others, but I do want you to know this table nonetheless. Okay, any questions?